topic of our panel discussion is privacy, right? And I would love to start our conversation with, I guess, one of the most important thing which rises in my head when we're talking about privacy. It's regulation, right? And I guess it's one of the main topics and one of the main problems when we're talking about privacy and such privacy solutions as Monero or Dash or any other, right? So the privacy of such solutions blocks the governments from officially recognizing cryptocurrencies or other solutions, right? So what I would like to ask is, what do you think? Will governments understand the new paradigm, yes, underlying under this technology, that we are now trusting the code, we do not trust the people, right? Will they do that, and will they officially recognize cryptocurrencies and other solutions? And what are the problems that block the governments from recognizing it officially now?
Sure. So I'm of the opinion that a lot of privacy-enhancing technologies are largely misunderstood, especially by governments, because it's something unfamiliar to them. Normally, in order to go outside of governmental control or observation, you need to jump through hoops, you need to spend a lot of money, and now suddenly there are these privacy-enhancing technologies that let you do that for, well, relatively for free. I think that can be something that's quite abrasive to a government, especially a government that wants to retain some control. At the same time, I think that they're starting to learn that they're not able to wrest control through technical means. And so what I suspect is going to happen over time is that eventually some governments will realize that they need to provide a regulatory sandbox, that they need to provide better tooling for people to be able to report things, and that they need to rely on good old-fashioned police work. And then eventually people will move, companies will move to those countries where, from a regulatory perspective, it is better suited. And we're going to have a bit of regulatory arbitrage play out. At least that's what I suspect will happen.
We already have such countries, right?
Yep.
What are the countries now, right now?
So at the moment, we're seeing a lot of stuff happening in like Japan and in certain parts of Europe, like in Switzerland. We've seen how they've started to think about how they can accommodate foundations. And then we have Bermuda as well, that's wanting to become a big player in that space. St. Kitts and Nevis also wanting to provide a nice regulatory or a welcoming regulatory framework.
Cool. Thanks so much. Jason.
Yeah, so Gennaro Network, I mean, as a platform, we're not directly providing privacy services per se, but the apps that would be developed on Gennaro have an interest in doing that. So we, as a platform, like to think about questions like privacy versus confidentiality versus transparency, which are all very distinct concepts. And governments usually are looking at those things separately as well. We have to look at this question on a global basis. So everywhere that our platform is active, we're going to be looking at the regulatory environment and trying to adapt to it so that the people who are using our Gennaro platform are actually able to ensure they're in compliance with various regulations. Some markets are more difficult than others. So we have a strong background in Asia, Singapore, China specifically. Those are very different regulatory environments for things like data privacy and transparency. So, this is a big challenge going forward, but we kind of on behalf of those DApp developers are trying to sort out some of the issues so that they don't have to. We'll provide API keys and whatnot that will make it easier for them to automatically comply with various things across regulatory environments. So that's sort of our perspective on this.
But what can we do with such, for example, such currencies as Monero or Dash? They're fully private, right? So they will never be regulated? What will gonna happen?
Well, so again, I mean, Gennaro Network in this particular case doesn't have a position on cryptocurrencies and privacy coins and so forth. But on a personal level, I of course see there's a purpose for these in kind of the overall landscape of cryptocurrencies and tokens. But will they be allowed to operate in every country? I don't believe so. I think some of these will be either not allowed to be utilized by official institutions, by regulation or otherwise. Others will exist kind of in an extra legal environment, meaning that people will use them, but they won't know whether they're in compliance with the law or not, because it's sort of a question that the law hasn't yet.
And that's the problem.
Question.
Right?
Exactly.
When you don't know whether you are compliant or not, it's a problem, very big problem for the government.
Definitely.
But Kate, you were a former federal prosecutor at U.S. Justice Department, right? And you were in charge of the crypto prosecution. So I guess you have an opinion on that definitely.
Yeah.
Kate?
Well, first of all, I think most of the regulation that we're seeing now, at least in the U.S. and in some of the other countries, is happening through the on and the off ramps. But I think it's really interesting because right now what you're seeing with governments and also in society is there are these two competing priorities. On the one hand, you have this trend toward unmasking. We're talking about fiat currency now, right? We have in the US all kinds of laws and regulations that make it really easy when you're using fiat currency to mask true ownership. In fact, the US Senate held hearings on modernizing the anti-money laundering laws. It's widely known now that actually the US is the easiest country to launder money in with fiat currency. $300 billion in the US is laundered every single year. And as Senator Grassley said in early December at these hearings, only 99.9% of money laundering crimes with fiat currency succeed. So we're 0.1 decimal percent away from total failure. So obviously the anti-money laundering laws aren't working with respect to fiat. And one of the reasons why is the laws around concealed beneficial ownership, shell companies. It's very easy for organized crime, for hackers, for thieves, for fraudsters to park fiat currency in this country and mask the true identities of who owns it. So on the one hand, there's this trend you have now toward unmasking all of that. And this was kind of started with some of the Panama Papers, and that trend is very much continuing. At the same time, there's this competing trend, and that is this trend for it's not a trend, this need for privacy. And, I think plenty of people in the government understand that. Look, I mean, we saw the OPM breach and all of the countless breaches that have happened since then, whether you're talking about financial records, whether you're talking about medical privacy, the Anthem breach. And so there's this tremendous need for privacy. And how do you square these two competing priorities? I think they're really headed in a collision course, and also the regulations are too. You have things like GDPR, which will come into effect in May, coming into effect out of Europe. But for all companies who have European citizens. So companies in the United States who have data of European citizens will have to comply with GDPR. GDPR has Article 17, the right to be forgotten, the right to be erased. How do you square that law with the laws that not just the US has, by the way, all kinds of jurisdictions have anti-money laundering laws and know your customer laws that says, hey, you have to keep data on your customer for 5 years and you must keep all of their transaction history and their transaction records. And really, how are governments going to enforce these totally different kind of collision course compliance regimes that are coming to a head? I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, and you've also mentioned Panama Papers, right? So it's unmasking all of the people behind this money. So maybe privacy is not needed. Maybe just make it public.
Well, that's it. Fiat. By the way, all of this unmasking, trend toward unmasking, is predominantly being driven by all of the money laundering crimes going on with fiat currency, not cryptocurrency. Yeah. Not to say that there are not money laundering crimes that can occur with cryptocurrency. Of course there are, just like as with any kind of asset. But I absolutely think that privacy is needed. I think most people in the government would agree with that. But in terms of how are they going to enforce some of the new privacy laws and square those with some of the existing anti-money laundering laws? And really, what makes it difficult is companies are going to have to figure that out in the first instance.
Making profits.
Because the governments are going to come along with enforcement actions where they think it's not been done correctly.
I got it. Thanks. Michael, do you have? You want to say something? Do you have the opinion on that?
Yeah, I probably could add that, well, all these things which we see with blockchain, cryptocurrencies like Monero or the tool to build applications working with private data like we are building, they provide merely the tools to keep the data or the transactions private, but also they provide tools to comply with different regulations. It's just the matter of applying these tools. So in principle, the government could kind of agree upfront with users or with platforms to comply with regulations. They should be open about it so everybody will know about it, and the government will get access or temporary access to let's say, users' data or users' transactions, only if the users allow that. And this will be like on a totally volunteer basis. And this kind of sounds more fair than if users didn't know that government is looking at what's going on. And I think this way, this world of regulations and world of tools which could potentially allow to break regulations, these worlds can coexist, because these tools, they actually allow good things like data privacy, and data privacy is also actually required by some regulations. And I guess for the governments to try to fight with these tools is not really useful for the governments themselves. As an example, I can probably provide the concept of strong encryption. Like strong encryption was controlled by the US government, so by export controls, and it couldn't be exported. Nevertheless, it's just an algorithm, so these algorithms which do strong encryption obviously are used outside the US, and basically controlling those is not effective. What is more effective is basically somehow collaborating with users. And as encryption is widespread and very useful today to secure, for example, our online interaction with banks, it's definitely these tools which we have with blockchain will be very, very useful, and it's just government should collaborate with those, I think.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, heading to privacy as it is, right? We've mentioned Panama Papers. We've mentioned, for example, big companies storing data and collecting data about us and making even profits out of that, right? But if you're a good person, for example, why you should hide some info? Maybe we even don't need privacy, right? What do you think? Maybe privacy is not needed.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you could just give me your credit card number and expiry date, that'd be great.
I don't use credit cards. I use Bitcoins and Monero.
So I think I've heard this argument before. It's the nothing to hide argument, right? Why should you worry about privacy if you have nothing to hide? And there are two things I'd like to mention. The first is a quote that's always struck me. I don't agree with everything he said, but everything he says. But there's a quote from Edward Snowden, and he says, saying that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is like saying you don't care about the right to free speech because you have nothing to say. And I thought that really encapsulates a lot of the reasons why we would want to embrace a right to privacy. But moreover, or more importantly than that, is the fact that the adversaries that privacy defends against are not just the governments. It's not like we're saying governments are bad and so we need privacy to protect us against, government influence or whatever. Privacy is way bigger than that. It protects us against so many things, but just take one, targeted crime. If you are able to determine the amount of money that somebody has in Bitcoin or Monero or whatever, then why won't you go and kidnap them and beat them over the head with a wrench until they give you their private keys? I mean, it makes sense. You know, it's a common wrench attack.
Actually, it's happening in Ukraine
It's absolutely. There's we've got
And
actual
Canada.
cases. Yeah, we have
Canada
that
too.
exchanger was knocked up,
Yeah.
and the guy that was kidnapped in
Ukraine.
In Ukraine.
Yeah.
now. Like
and-
Exmo founder or
Yeah.
CEO. Something.
And this is going to happen more and more and more as long as people can determine the amount of money that you have in cryptocurrencies, which is why I'm very sad to say that I lost all of my cryptocurrency in a terrible boating accident. It happens.
I think it's a great point that Ricardo makes, though. It's not just governments that, you know, it's important that we guard privacy against just governments. It's really against all kinds of big data, but against criminal actors, against hackers. I mean, I'll tell you that people that work in the government use privacy-enhancing technologies all the time, not because they think their colleagues are necessarily spying on them, but because they think, I don't want to put that in an email or a text message that a hacker could get. I'll use Signal instead. And at least that's better, or it's more privacy guarding than some other kind of forms of communication. So I think privacy is absolutely important. I can tell you why I think so. I spent over a decade as a federal prosecutor, and you know, during that time, we got a lot of search warrants for people's communications, right? Where we had probable cause demonstrated and a judge sign off saying that there was a crime committed. And I could tell you that in over a decade of seeing some of those, you know, which are people, you could make anyone look like a horrible person if you had their emails or communications. You can make any of us sitting up here look absolutely awful because you can cherry pick out things. The government can do that, but not just the government, right? Hackers, criminals, extortionists. And so I think it's very important for that reason also, is that you can really paint a very untrue picture of people or of groups of individuals' actions.
Adi, maybe just to, is my mic on? Yeah.
That's your mic, yeah.
So just to build on what you were saying, the idea also is, it's not just about privacy, but I also think control of the data is a key issue for people, right? So a lot of people, you know, conflate privacy with control and say, well, if I wanted to, you know, control my own data, would I actually keep it 100% confidential? Would I not want to perhaps sell that data myself to an advertiser who might be interested to know what are my preferences and be compensated for that rather than having a third party, you know, a Google or a Facebook selling my data for me? And I really don't get much out of that except I get to see the ads that they want to serve to my newsfeed. So one of the interesting applications of blockchain in regard to privacy is, can we give control of people's data back to them? Right? And that's, again, as a platform, something that we're thinking about. We want to explore use cases where people get their data back into their own hands and then can leverage and monetize their own data. So I think that's just in the context of what we're discussing. It's not always about keeping your data 100% private. That's important too, but maybe it's more about control.
That's so interesting because it's not just financial, right? I mean, there are all kinds of data that you might want to sell or rent or give away. And maybe it's medical data, maybe it's medical records, and this whole notion of centralization. First of all, it's not secure, right? We saw that with the Anthem breach. That people's medical data centralized is not a good idea. It's also inconvenient if you think about when you want to request your own medical records. You have to go to all of these different doctors. Maybe you want to share your medical records with someone without having to fill out forms and fax it. I was asked to fax it recently. I said, who has a fax machine still in their house? In any event, you could rather use some kind of blockchain-enabled systems, and that's where you're really talking about privacy, right, and encrypted systems, but to allow people to access it. Maybe you want to share it with researchers for free. Maybe you want to sell it to other companies, and I think that's a really important point and use case.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
very
true.
good point you're making. We've observed many many startups who want to give medical records back to the patients so that they share them with doctors, appearing everywhere in the world, in the US and Asia and Europe, and this seems to be a very, very strong trend.
Yeah, totally true. And for me, actually, I guess to crown it all, it's like privacy is when you give your own data and you do something and reveal something when you desire to do that, but not when someone wants to get it, right? Cool. We just have less than 3 minutes, as I see already. Time goes very quickly. So I would like to have some conclusions on what we've just discussed, right? Regarding regulations, regarding privacy as it is. And the topic of our discussion is where are we headed in 2018, right? So in terms of regulations, in terms of privacy solutions, where and when we will reach, do you think? Okay, I don't ask you for like some exact dates or something, but actually, when do you think we will reach some consensus, maybe with governments? Will it happen in 2018? And what's going to lead to that?
I think we're going to be in a bit of an arms race for a while. I think that there are companies that have partnered with governments, and they're trying to produce technology to break down some of the small privacy gains you get with something like Bitcoin, companies like Chainalysis and so on. And there's going to be a continuous set of improvements to try and defeat them and so on. And eventually it's going to reach a level of frustration where governments are frustrated and they realize they can't control the technology, they can't influence that, and they need to actually hand it off to someone else. They need to actually let people be in control of their own privacy, of their own data, of their own destiny. And I don't know if that's going to happen in 2018. I think that that might happen in the future, in a couple of years from now. I think we're going to have a rocky few years, to be honest. It's going to be difficult to convince governments that this is a good thing, and to really bring them over to our side of thinking. But I do think that we can eventually get there.
I guess most of the governments are still thinking of crypto, for example, as a paradigm scheme, and they think that like if they take responsibility for that, they will then have to, I don't know, to do something with that. So that's their main fear, and that's what they're scared of.
Absolutely.
Right. So.
So I would say that I would agree with Ricardo. In the short term, I don't think we'll see any conclusions from government. This is going to be a debate for some years to come. What I'd like to see for 2018 is we as individuals start to think about how our data is being used more. Where possible, many of us have already adopted cryptocurrencies for certain financial applications. What can we now do with blockchain to ensure our personal privacy, leveraging our own data? That's what I hope 2018 can mean for this question.
I think it's a long way off to reach any kind of consensus, but the one thing I would like to see more in 2018 is continued dialogue and a little bit more nuanced dialogue. I feel like, first of all, the government is made up of people, and people all have different ideas. I worked with people who thought Bitcoin is completely illegal and only used by criminals, and I worked with other people who use Bitcoin in their own life all the time. So it's really a spectrum, people who are in the government, federal agents. And so it's a spectrum, and I think what's missing is there's some really strident language used when you're talking about privacy, segments of the community who say privacy at all costs all the time, we don't want the government to have anything, and if they can't solve crimes, well then that's just too bad. On the other side of the spectrum, it's there shouldn't be any anonymizing technologies, forget it, these are really bad, and only people who have something to hide want to hide it. Those are two really extreme views, and I think one of the things that needs to happen is for a little more nuance to enter the discussions. And look, the government needs to recognize that the genie's out of the bottle, right? There are anonymizing technologies, not just in the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, but in all kinds of spaces. So the genie's out of the bottle. They're not going to be able to stop those technologies, but how can we work with reaching some kind of reasonable compromises along the way? What are those? And I think that's a matter of education. I think, for example, there's a view by some regulators that, Monero, for example, or some of Dash or Zcash, some of the privacy-enhancing cryptocurrencies are just only used by criminals. There is that view. I'm not endorsing that view, and I don't subscribe to that view, but there is that view. And yet, if you talk to Ricardo or you talk to the Monero team, you see actually that's just not simply the case. It's not that black and white, and that there are ways where both kinds of equities can be taken into account. And I think that's a bit, the government needs to be educated about that, and that's on them, but it's also on the community to do that. I mean, I always like to see at conferences like these, government participants in the audience, for example, learning about Monero, no matter, or any of these cryptocurrencies or privacy-enhancing technologies. No matter how many of these things I've gone to, I always myself learn a lot. Just today, backstage, learned a lot about Monero and some of the ways that it protects privacy, but yet some of the ways that it could still serve law enforcement interests in appropriate cases. So I think that education is what I would hope to see in 2018 and 2019.
Education. Okay, thanks.
And probably governments can, well, there are some, of course, there is some clashing going on with these technologies, but also there are some upsides which governments and existing compliance requirements can get from these technologies. Like, for example, with cryptocurrencies like Monero, you can comply with banking secrecy, or with NuCypher, you can probably comply with GDPR, and these are kind of, and probably governments should get as much more upside from these technologies rather than focusing on downsides. And since you cannot really stop these technologies, that probably makes the most sense.
Thank you so much, all of the panelists, for making it today. I hope it was valuable for all of you. And what I would love to say is like the last words. You know, money and fiat money is like money as it is has united people much better than any religion, right? And I hope that crypto will be the new stage of it. And in 2018, everyone, including the governments, will understand that. So thank you, everyone, and hope that was valuable for you. Thanks.